So, welcome everyone to a conversation on what makes a compelling memoir, sponsored by Saddle Road Press and featuring three Saddle Road Press authors: Marcia Meier, author of Face; Dawn Mitchell, author of Shibai; and Jayne Benjulian, author of 5 Sextillion Atoms. I'm Ruth Thompson, editor of Saddle Road Press. So, this is Face. At age 5, Marcia Meier was hit by a car, losing the left side of her face and eyelid. Over the next 15 years, she underwent 20 surgeries and spent days blinded by bandages, her hands tied to the sides of her hospital bed. Scarred both physically and emotionally, abused at school, blamed and rejected by her mother, Marcia survived and went on to create a successful life as a journalist, a wife, and mother. But at midlife, her controlled world began to fall apart, and Marcia began a journey into the darkness of her past, her true identity, her deepest beliefs, a spiritual and emotional exploration that resulted in the creation of Face. Marcia is an award-winning writer, writing coach, and developmental book editor, a respected newspaper journalist for nearly 20 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism and an MFA in creative writing, and has taught writing, including memoir writing, at the collegiate level and in private workshops for more than 20 years. In Japanese culture, shibai means drama or play, but in Hawaiian slang, it means smokescreen, bullshit, gaslighting. In his second Saddle Road Press book, Don Mitchell weaves together the brutal 1969 murder of his friend, Harvard graduate student Jayne Britton, his harassment by law enforcement and the media, the language and culture of the Nagovisi people of Bougainville, the high barrens of Mauna Kea, and ultra running and walking, to explore how memory and meaning shapeshift, the way facts can shatter long-held perceptions about oneself and others, and how love and connection transcend time and culture. Dawn grew up in Hilo on the island of Hawaii, studied anthropology, evolutionary biology, and creative writing at Stanford, and earned a PhD in anthropology from Harvard. He lived among the Nagovisi people of Bougainville for several years in the 1960s and 1970s, and returned in 2001 after Bougainville's War of Secession. His stories have won a Pushcart nomination and awards from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, New Millennium Writings, and other journals. 5 Sextillion Atoms is notable for the ways in which the poems combine stories of family history with larger matters of public history. While the concerns are often highly elegiac, the poems scrupulously avoid sentimentality and effusions. In Portraits and Satire, as a whole, the collection comprises a story of the making of a poet. Jayne Benjulian is the author of 5 Sextillion Atoms and poems and essays in numerous literary and performance journals. She was shortlisted for the James Hurst Poetry Prize and the Bridport Prize. Jayne served as Apple's chief speechwriter and director of new play development at Magic Theater in San Francisco. She has been an Ossabaw Island Project Fellow, teaching fellow at Emory University, lecturer in the graduate program in theater at San Francisco State University, and Fulbright teaching fellow in Lyon, France. She earned an MFA at the Warren Wilson Program for Writers and lives in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts. She works as a developmental editor, coaching writers in drafting and revising their manuscripts. All the books are available at Collected Works in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and at Odyssey Books in Ithaca, New York, and online at bookshop.org, indiebound.org, and all online booksellers. To begin, I'd like to ask each of our featured authors, Marcia and Dawn, to read briefly from their books, so those in the audience who have not had a chance yet to read the books can experience their flavor. Marcia, will you begin?
I would be happy to. And I also want to mention, because Jayne, who, as you mentioned, is a coach and developmental book editor, is actually the person who suggested this, because she does coach memoirists. And it was her idea to do this panel discussion on what makes a memoir compelling. So I want to thank her for all of her encouragement and her ideas. So I'm going to read from a very short section from one of the chapters in my book, which is maybe a third of the way into the story. And then I'll turn it over to Dawn. This chapter is called Eyelashes. April 6, 1962, surgeon's notes. Composite graft from left eyebrow into the left upper eyelid, transplanting hair of the eyebrow as lashes of upper eyelid. I awake. I am blind. My head is bandaged. I am anxious and afraid. No one is here. Then I am floating near the ceiling. I look down and see my body, head wrapped in gauze and tape, lying in the hospital bed. Intravenous tubing runs from a pole next to the bed into my arm. I watch the liquid drip into my veins. I hear the hiss of the oxygen tank next to the bed. I see the bed table nearby. I see the waist-high counter along the wall with trays and medical instruments atop it. I float there for what seems a long time, watching, absorbing the scene, trying to comprehend how I can be in the bed and at the ceiling at the same time. A nurse walks in and I'm back to the body, lying on the bed as she explains she has come to check the dressings on my face. At midlife, I was struck by the realization that whenever I thought of myself, I didn't see my face. There was only an essence, like that disembodied self floating at the ceiling, a bright being without shape or form, bodiless, as if because I had to give over my body to nurses and doctors in hospitals as a child, a body that I believed at my deepest level was disfigured and useless, it was safer and more accurate to see myself as essence, just personality. In time, I began to see my faces, separate and many. There is the young, ravaged face that others saw, the unmolested 5-year-old face that exists only in a black and white photo that hangs on my wall. The face they tell me today they see as beautiful, though I still don't believe them. My long limbs became visible to me, my thin, awkward frame with its patchwork of skin grafts on my stomach, chest, legs, transformed into a physical house I could inhabit. But still the essence face is the only one that allows me to move through the world. When I was young, people often asked about my face, especially kids who were often unkind or unthinking. As I grew older, I developed a standard response. Adults seem to know better than to ask, what happened to your face? And in fact, over time, I rarely thought of my face or how I looked to others. I can't remember a friend or even a new acquaintance in recent years who has asked about my face. Eventually, somehow the question comes up and I explain. And usually the friend will say, I don't even notice it. But when I was in my late 30s, I was invited to read to a class of second graders at an elementary school in Santa Barbara. I was about halfway through the picture book when a kid sitting in the front raised his hand. Yes, I said. You look like a witch, he said. My stomach clenched. Your eye, it looks like a witch. The other kids laughed. In a flash, I was at St. Joe's again. I felt like crawling under the chair, but instead I smiled and explained what had happened to me, adding a lesson about always looking both ways before crossing a street. I read the rest of the book and escaped as fast as I could. I hadn't felt that stab of pain and shame in a long time. A week later, I got a packet in the mail. It contained letters of apology from the whole class, including a note from the teacher saying how embarrassed and sorry she was for the rudeness of the boy. I threw them all in the trash. Thank you. So, Don, you want to?
Don, would you read for us?
Yeah, I'm going to read actually the first chapter, the beginning. The phone rings. Caller ID shows a 617 number. So you wonder if some troll from the Boston Globe's website has found your phone number in Hawaii. It's been 48 years since your friend Jayne was murdered, and her name and picture were splashed across the Globe's pages. It's been 3 days since the Globe published an article about Jayne's murder, and now, in spring 2017, you're being savaged in the comment section. You told Todd Wallach, the journalist, how you'd kept the blood-stained goat hair rug that her body was covered with, never imagining that readers would find this repulsive, even a sign that you were the killer. So because you're pissed off and ready to tell any trolls to go screw themselves, you pick up the phone. It's a Massachusetts State Police detective, Sergeant Peter Sennett. And after he identifies himself, you say, "This is about Jayne, isn't it?" And you listen while he gets to the point, which is to ask if he'll submit to DNA testing. You don't speak for a moment because you haven't forgotten how the cops tried to pin Jayne's murder on you. You haven't forgotten what leaked out of the grand jury room. But a DNA test can exclude you and put it all to rest, so it's worth it. And a refusal would draw suspicion to you again, and you don't want to risk that. Maybe your "of course" surprises him, maybe not. He doesn't let on. What happened 48 years ago went something like this. Early on the morning of January 7th, 1969, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, someone struck Jayne Sanders Britton in the forehead with a sharp object, probably rendering her unconscious, then carried or dragged her to her bed, and using that tool or something else, smashed in the left occipital portion of her skull, killing her, covered her up with a goat hair rug and a coat, threw red ochre over her, and left. Asleep in your apartment next door, you heard nothing. Around noon, Jayne's boyfriend, a fellow Harvard graduate student, knocked on your door. "Jayne missed her exam. I went in. Something's wrong," he said. So you walked down the short hall to her apartment with him, and Jayne's murder closed around you. Over the years, it sometimes held you tightly, sometimes loosely, but it didn't let go for half a century. For the next month, you and your first wife, Jill Nash, endured not just the loss of a close friend, but the attentions of the police, ravenous media, an unsupportive Harvard anthropology department, polygraphs, and finally, a grand jury with a leak. 2 months later, you left Cambridge to begin anthropological fieldwork on a southwestern Pacific island called Bougainville, among a people called the Nargavisi. You lived with them on and off for the next 5 years. They've been a part of your life and you of theirs for more than 50 years. What they taught you and information you've gathered on your own have yielded an academic book and some articles, some published poetry and some fiction. Sometimes the creative has gotten tangled up with the science, but never by accident. In spring 2017, Jayne's murder closed around you again. In the 4 years since you'd moved back to your childhood home in Hilo, your life had fallen into a pleasant pattern. You laughed and worked with your partner, Ruth Thompson, a poet, wrote fiction, designed books for small presses, sold photographs, spent as much time as you could in the high back country of Hawaii Island, and took 20, 30, even more than 40-mile walks. Then suddenly there were people clamoring for your attention, and very old memories became important in ways they never had been. Over the years, you'd rarely had to retrieve them and talk about them, and then only with friends who knew nothing about the case. These people were Todd, Becky Cooper, a former The New Yorker staffer working on a book about the case, and Sergeant Sennett. Todd's article was less about the murder than about how the Suffolk County DA had refused multiple Freedom of Information Acts for the case files. Becky's project focused on the murder, but also the Harvard anthropology community, Jayne herself, and the ways in which her story had evolved. Sergeant Sennett was, well, you weren't sure what he was or what he was really up to. After getting off the phone, you immediately email Todd and tell him. He returns a link to a story on a Boston TV station featuring District Attorney Ryan, Todd, Michael Widmer, a former journalist whose first assignment as a cub reporter was Jayne's murder, and offstage, Becky and a young Colorado woman, Alyssa Bertetto, who had become interested in the case and was investigating it on her own. DA Ryan seems uncomfortable, defensive. She can't honor the FOIA request because the case is active. They're doing DNA work, she says. That's me, you think. Then your stomach tightens. They're trying again.
As Marcia said, you originally suggested the subject for this conversation. Would you tell us how you came to be interested in what makes a compelling memoir and what you think the keys to that are?
Yeah. After my poetry collection came out from Savile Road, I began, about a year later, I began work on a long prose piece and also started coaching other writers, writing their mostly memoirs. And so I wanted to take a deep dive into the form and find out what made the works I loved compelling. And what is it in a memoir? Because as we all know, memoir is not an autobiography. So I decided there were three things for me that made the memoir compelling. And the first, of course, is what makes any book compelling, the author's language. And of course, part of that language is the creation of a very particular voice who sees the world in her own eccentric way. The second element for me, of course, is an interesting life, an interesting story, right? And sometimes it is the perception of that voice that makes the story interesting. And in someone else's eyes, someone else might not have seen that story. But the third thing for me was kind of a discovery, and that is that the story needs to have an urgent, dramatic premise. There needs to be a reason why the eye of the book, why the author has undertaken the memoir to tell us her story. What is she searching for? What problem is she trying to solve? So for me, just to review, it's language and the voice that language creates, the story as seen through the voice or the eyes of that particular narrator, and third, the dramatic premise. What is the urgency? Why the search? Why the memoir?
That's great. Yeah. So I guess I would ask first for both Marcia and Don, what was the dramatic premise in your book? What do you think kind of initiates everything? I'll start with you, Marcia.
Yeah, so I think for me, it was a midlife a midlife, I don't want to say crisis, but a midlife reckoning when I turned 50 and I started to, and things were not working well in my life and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And my husband and I went to marriage counseling, and after quite a long time, and it wasn't seeming to do anything for us, so we stopped. But I realized I needed, for whatever reason, I needed to keep talking. And so I went back to my therapist, and it was his question, probably just a couple of sessions in with him, where he asked me about my scars and how I felt about them. And I realized at that moment that I had tried not to think about them or feel about them for 30 years. And that was the beginning for me of I had to go back in time and figure out what had happened to me, how it affected me as a child, and then even more important for me, how it had affected me as an adult. So that was the premise for me. The urgent premise was I just knew I had to go back in time and find out what had happened and how, I knew the general reasons for it, but I wanted to know, why had it happened and how did it affect my life?
Yeah.
So that was the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And Don, how about you?
Well, I think on one level, the dramatic premise was the murder of my friend, but that had happened 50 years before. And although I'd thought about it for a long time and had toyed with writing a novel about it, it wasn't until Becky Cooper came to Hilo to interview me and Sergeant Sennett came that it suddenly turned into something else. It was no longer a memory of a dear friend who had been murdered, but it was instead that past, almost 50-year-old past, jumping up and grabbing me, as I said in the part that I wrote. And so the dramatic premise was not just who killed my friend, which existed in the distant past, but what were people going to be doing about it right now in 2017? And that, I think, more than anything else, is what spurred me to write, being in the whirlwind and having the past jump up and punch me in the mouth and grab me by the shoulders and shake me, or whatever, however you want to talk about it. That's what got it started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and also it seemed to me the fear that all of a sudden you were under the microscope again.
Yeah. And
Yes,
then
that's true. And what was the only thing, well, I shouldn't say the only thing, but what was interesting to me at the time and since then about the fear was that it was genuine fear, but at the same time, I was sort of thinking, I'm scared. I was thinking, no, you're not. This is crazy. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. What's the matter with you? You know, it doesn't work that way. The DA does not reach out and frame some guy in Hilo for murder. But I couldn't put those two things together. I was still frightened. And
well, and you had been told the story that they tried to frame you before, and that they brought it to the grand jury, so there was reason to be suspicious.
yeah.
Jayne, you were talking about structure. Tell us a little bit about what your interest in that and what you see in these two books.
Yeah, I think that it's always fascinating to me in a successful memoir when the structure resonates with the meaning the narrator is trying to communicate. When the structure is not arbitrary, but emphasizes or enlightens us about what the narrator is trying to say. And these two books in particular, I think, have interesting structurally from that perspective. So, for example, Marcia, how does the structure of your book resonate with what you are trying to say, or what you do say?
Thank you. I actually I hadn't really thought about this, but someone mentioned it to me in one of the other readings that I've done. And because the structure is an unusual experimental structure, and it uses the surgeon's notes from all of the surgeries to begin almost all the chapters. And then it begins with an old memory, from hospitalization or a surgery, and then moves forward in time. And then eventually moves to present day, and then goes back in time. And each chapter, because we go back to those surgeries, back to the beginning essentially, and then move forward, it's kind of like Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking. We're going back to the place where everything started and where everything happened, and then try to make sense of that, but then return again. And it may be that that's essentially what I was doing in the writing of it too, was in my own sense of my own emotional cycle, my own emotional resolution was to keep going back to that time and trying to make sense of it as well.
Yeah, Donna, I remember when we were talking about Marcia's book one day, you had the most interesting comparison of its structure to music. Could you talk about that now?
I will. And by the way, for everybody out there, our two cats escaped from where they had been, where they had been put. So if something crashes, or if I scream because a claw has entered my thigh, then you'll know why. Yeah, I did. When I was reading Marcia's book, it made me think of Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition in which every large section of the piece is preceded by a little theme, some in the orchestral version with a trumpet and the piano, it's a piano, of course, but it's short, it's always there, and yet it changes its pace, it changes its key. Sometimes it goes ahead and weaves itself right into the following section of music, and sometimes it doesn't. And I saw Marcia's surgeon's notes as doing that. They proceed, but in a fairly limited time period. And then the big piece that Marcia has written goes on, of course, for many years. And so I was quite struck by that. And you're always brought back and introduced, never the same way twice, but you are always introduced each time. And I was quite fond of that.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
Look forward to it.
Yeah. And Dawn, about your structure, I know that, I mean, one of the things, which isn't really structure, maybe it's voice, but the use of the second person throughout, but also the kind of, I don't know, for me, I always think of it as kind of spiraling out, gathering in all kinds of seemingly disconnected pieces, field notes from Nagovisi, and doing 45-mile walks over the Saddle Road, and a section on how you count in the Nagovisi language, and having cancer, and together with the memories of Jayne's murder and the Cambridge cops and being lied to about being a suspect and all this stuff. And then the police coming to Hawaii and Becky and you working together, all this stuff kind of spiraling and spiraling. And then it all kind of resolves into a minor chord at the end. That's how it feels to me. But that may, I mean, I know you said something about you even had a spreadsheet that you were using to control the, yeah, which, yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Well,
it's kind of Joycean, actually, you know, different colors of, anyway.
yeah, and Ruth, originally Shibai existed as an 8,000 word piece that I submitted to a journal for a contest. Didn't win, but it was short, of course, at least from the point of view of a book. 7,000 words is short, and so it kind of foreshadowed the structure of the book in the sense that some of it was in 1969, some of it was in 2017. But what I was trying to do, and then I think did do in the book, was a spiral, as Ruth said, but then in the end, it was almost like something circling a drain, although that way, or a tornado. A tornado would be better, sucking things up, but the mess is up at the top. And the mess is where I was when I was writing the book, and all these other things were down the funnel of the tornado. And yeah, Ruth, since you mentioned that, I was concerned. The book has 55 chapters and 265 pages, which is really quite extraordinary, but I wanted to write it that way. Some of the chapters are a page and a half long, you know, some are 10 pages long. And the idea was that the reader would be herself rocked back and forth, you know, oh, we're here. No, now we're here. Oh, now we're here, but we're looking at something that was back there. And at one point I got nervous and I decided I better just see how long all these chapters are. So I put them in an Excel spreadsheet, believe it or not, with the number of words. And I just kind of looked at it, 600, 700, 900, 1800. Uh-oh, you know, I have to do something there. And I moved stuff around like that, and I color coded, you know, anyway. So the structure was meant to the extent that I could pull it off, was meant to seem like a vortex or a tornado and take the reader and spin that person around just as I was spun around.
It's actually very trendy, you know, Dawn, short chapters.
Yeah.
I personally love reading long books with short chapters.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that I think is really interesting, Don, Barbara Yoder just asked me if I kept a spreadsheet, and I'm like, oh God, no, I didn't, and all I did was kept, you know, coming back to the childhood scenes to keep going. But what I love about your book, one of the things I love about it is the second person. Because it's second person, as all of us who are writers know, is a really risky thing to try. And to sustain it over a whole book length work is pretty astonishing. And I think you did an amazingly brilliant job with that. It's something that even agents and editors will say, don't ever write in second person, but you did, and it's very successful.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, maybe you should rewrite Face in third person. One morning, Marcia.
I don't think Marcia really wants to rewrite Faith. I think she may have had it.
It could be another version. No, but person is interesting, and you know, I just felt as though first person wasn't going to work for me because it would be too much like I was speaking. Of course it is. But I didn't think that the subject material lent itself to that. I didn't want to tell the story. I wanted to be seen telling the story. That would be one way to put it.
But as a poet, using the second person is a way of having a witness self talking to the active self. And so there is an element of meditation that's brought in just by using the second person in that way. So poets do use it more, I think, than people writing fiction or nonfiction, but I thought it was very effective. I liked it. Yeah.
All right.
Let's see, here we are. Jayne, coming back to the subject of compelling memoir, what do you find compelling about each of these books?
Well, many things, but one thing I would love to call out is, it's interesting, an element of both books, Marcia's use of the surgeon and Dawn's use of Becky Cooper.
Mhm.
I found those very engaging. So Marcia has surgeon's notes at the head of the chapters, which gives us a kind of objective truth, fact, documentary. We all know surgeons aren't perfectly objective, but comparatively and relatively speaking, it gives us kind of what I call a cool narration, so that the reader leans forward and it's not begged by the writer for emotion or engagement. The reader leans forward to find what is going on in the narrator's life. And what it struck me in an amazing way last night, I streamed the play Molly Sweeney from the Irish Repertory Theatre. And that play is 3 long monologues. One by the woman who's the subject of the play, Molly Sweeney, one by her husband, both deeply, deeply subjective, and one by her surgeon.
Oh, really?
Yes, it is fascinating. And the surgeon, of course, he's not completely objective, but he is scientific. And I thought immediately of Marcia's book, because in the same way we lean forward to try to look at these lives from illuminated with a different kind of light. And I think that's what Marcia's doing. So the reader moves toward her without being asked to move toward her. And she can fill out the context of her life. And I found in a very different way, the use of Becky Cooper, the New Yorker staffer. I found her performing the same function in Don's book. So Don doesn't have to ask all these questions. He doesn't have to go through a tedious, discursive narrative explaining everything that happened to Jayne. He can allow Becky Cooper from the New Yorker to ask him those questions. And then again, the reader can lean forward to find out, here's the story. Here's what happened. It's kind of ingenious. I know it probably happened intuitively, Don, and naturally, but it is in the end an ingenious way to balance that story.
Yeah.
So that's what I find among the compelling things, that's what I find one of the most compelling about each book.
That's really interesting, Jayne. Really. Yeah.
Yeah, you hadn't said that before when we've been talking. That is, yeah, I like that.
Fascinating. Yeah. Marcia, you talked about at some point the kind of emotional difficulty of coming to write this book. What was the most difficult thing for you in writing the book?
Well, I'm actually thinking a lot about this because with the book coming out, I am finding that I'm feeling a lot of re-traumatizing, which is a really interesting thing that I never would have expected. Even during the writing of the book, yes, I often sobbed through the writing. It was cathartic and helpful, but I didn't expect to have this level of emotional response to the book coming out and talking about it with people. But it definitely, you know, it was part of the journey to go back in time and try to understand and to confront all of that pain and suffering that I experienced, not just in the hospitalizations and the surgeries, but, you know, being teased as a kid and having to be fairly disfigured throughout most of my childhood. So in the writing of this, I had to go back and feel those feelings and try to remember scenes from the hospitals. And I've talked about this before, but all of those memories are so vivid for me. And so to write about them, I had to experience them again. And as I'm discovering now, to even talk about them all, it's starting to,
Yeah.
like, feeling all those feelings again as well. So it was a very emotional journey for me.
I know that even in the editorial process, when we were working together to come up with the kind of the final draft, I kept wanting you to be angry. And you seem to have surmounted anger way too quickly for me. like, I was angry on your behalf.
You were. You wanted to pummel my mother. Thank you.
Yes, yes. If she had been around, I would have.
Well, that was, you know, you really helped me come to terms with that. Like, why? Because I certainly did feel anger over all of those years, and how, and I did come to a place of understanding and even forgiveness, with my mom and with the surgeon and all the people that I had been hurt by. And of course, there's, you know, there's that feeling that you want to kind of go to bat for me, because of the injustices and the unfairness of a lot of the things that happened to me when I was really little.
Yeah.
But you know, I don't feel anger anymore. I do kind of get mad at Grandpa Ben when I let myself think about him.
Oh yeah.
But, you know, but other than that, you know, and it was helpful for you to push me to feel those feelings.
Yeah. Well, I think we all, when we're reading the book, here's this little girl, you know, and it's just unbearable, the things that are happening to her. You know, you just want to go in there and hold her, and, you know, so yeah, it's very touching. Yeah. Yeah.
I've had a lot of people say that same thing to me, which is very lovely. I feel very warm and you know, about that.
Yeah. Don, how about you? What was the most difficult thing? It doesn't have to be necessarily be an emotional thing, but
Yeah, well, but it was, well, some of the technical things, but they're boring, so I'm not going to talk about them. But although I was going to, but no, Marcia was talking about memory and remembering things and what comes with them, and I realized a lot of what I wrote had to do with memory. Well, I mean, of course it did, but the failure of memory, you know, we all forget. There's nobody who doesn't forget stuff, so we all forget things. But what I learned and had to come to terms with, and A, how to write about it, and B, how I felt about it, was having remembered things incorrectly, having been quite certain that something happened in one way, but it didn't. Or wait a minute, maybe it did. And I remembered correctly, and the other person isn't remembering correctly. And the necessity to try to come to terms with gaps and misapprehensions. And Marcia talked about remembering pain. And one of the things that I probably should have gone a little bit more into in the book was, yes, I remember being grilled by the police, and yes, I remember the media, and I remember all those things. But at one point in the book, I say, you know, what you went through was nothing compared to other suspects, you know, other policemen, other interview rooms. You know, nobody beat me up. Nobody held me for 48 hours without contact with anybody else. And yet my memory of those events, what did happen, were strong and negative. But then as I looked at them from 50 years later and saying, was it really that bad? Sometimes I had to say to myself, you know what, it wasn't really that bad. You just remember that it was bad. And that kind of memorization, well, not memorization, but those kinds of memories were the ones that I was dealing with more often. And then, you know, excuse me, again, just for 30 years or 50 years, what am I saying? I believed that a certain guy had killed my friend, and he didn't. And I had to come to terms with that in 2018 when the case was solved. And I had to say to myself, he didn't kill her. And he was dead, so I couldn't apologize to him, which made it even more difficult. There was nothing I could do except say, I'm sorry to the universe. You know, I'm sorry that I believed all those years and got angry at you and everything, and wished every bad thing to happen to you because I wrongly thought that you killed my friend. So I had to deal with some of those kinds of things. And then, as Ruth said, just circling back, and I'll finish here, she said, Ruth said, oh, you ended on a minor key. And that's true. You know, it was difficult to come to the end here. And the only way I did it, I didn't plan to do it. I went for a walk in the woods, and my cat, when he was up on the mantle while I was talking, came along with me. And I ended up going for a walk with my cat. And how that played out, what I said into my phone, that was the last chapter, and it's called Catwalk, which has, of course, as we all know, multiple meanings. But yeah, so that was difficult. You know, there was a day in which I said, I got to wrap this thing up. I got to wrap this thing up. You know, I've got to finish this thing, and I don't know how to do it. And then I went for a walk with my cat.
I'm going to look and see if there are any. Oh, here's a good
We have
question.
a couple of questions. So yeah.
Did any of you use Scrivener for organizing your memoirs? Good question.
Oh, couldn't live without it. I don't know who asked that. Scrivener is the best thing that there is in the world because it's a writing tool, and it gives you enormous ability to move things around. That's what I like about it more than anything else. You know, each chapter or even smaller sections that I had were a little Scrivener chunk of text, and on my computer screen, I could drag them around to whatever order I wanted them in, read it in that order. No, that's not right. Anyways, I can't imagine life without Scrivener. Who asked that question? You're
Mary.
Mary
already.
asked that question. And Don, you're much more of the scientist than I am. And I have Scrivener. I've worked on Scrivener with some other projects, but I did not use it for this book. And nor did I use, as I mentioned, I didn't use spreadsheets either. And I actually, looks like Barbara asked a question too about how did I keep track of my scenes? And that was just a matter of just reading through it, all, you know, going over it, printing it out and reading it again and scratching stuff out. And in fact, Jayne actually read an early version of this and suggested that I delete a good chunk of it, which I did. And I ended up rewriting, well, I finished the first draft of this in 2012 when I got my MFA because it was my thesis. And then over the next 8 years, I just deleted scenes and added scenes. And even in the last year working with Ruth before the book came out, I added a lot of stuff back in. Mm-hmm. So it was just really a process of trial and error and deleting and adding and remembering new things to add to it. Yeah, and it's funny because the end of my book, which is when I went back to Michigan for one of my uncle's funerals in 2016, that was a kind of a late addition too, because I didn't know how to end my book either. And it is kind of funny, it's almost serendipitous the way something happens and you realize all of a sudden, oh, that's going to be a good way to wrap the book up.
Yeah.
Mary also asked if, she said, sometimes the retelling is therapeutic and sometimes it's traumatic. And what do we think the difference is? And, that's interesting. I think writing this book was incredibly therapeutic for me. I mean, it's why I started writing it. I would guess that Don also got a lot of therapeutic value out of writing his book as well. I did not expect it to be traumatic for me when it was published. which is kind of silly because even reading portions of it to people before would get me very emotional. I had to practice so I wouldn't cry. So I don't know why I didn't think it would be not traumatic, but yeah, it's just an interesting, after I did the first 3 readings in the first 2 weeks after the book came out, I really was happy to have some time to just stop for a while and not read it and not kind of live it over and over again. So it's an interesting.
It's going deeper each time too when you go back. So
I
yeah.
thought it was both therapeutic, excuse me, and traumatic. And I'll just give one example. When I learned from a series of phone calls in 2018, who the killer had been and how Jayne had been killed, I realized in a moment that I had never, ever put myself in her head while she was being attacked and then killed, that I had just drawn a curtain over that. I sanitized it, if you like, just assumed that she had been knocked out and the rest she would never have experienced. But then I was forced, by what I learned, I was forced to realize that there were times in which she had to have been experiencing what happened to her. Among other things, she fought her killer. And what was going on in her head there. And so that was traumatic for me to think about that. And then I also had to realize, why all these years you never did that? All these years you never thought about what your friend's feelings and what was going on in her head. So that, and then the therapeutic part was that I felt much better after that. So things had left me at that point. Say, okay, now I know what happened those few minutes in her apartment, 30 feet from where I was asleep. Now I know what happened, and it was better then.
And you were able to do a kind of ceremony of grieving, and that I think also is a way of putting something down. I mean, I think when you think about it, when all this happened initially for you, Dawn, it was traumatic, and then all of a sudden there was the police were horrible in the things that they were saying to you about her and about you, and the accusations and the violence, and showing you like a flayed skull, and just like these horrible things. So it's like you aren't ever able to grieve for your friend. You're so traumatized. It's like you just, and so my memory of the way this ended was that you were able to grieve for her and to do kind of a ceremony of grieving, and that was a way of closure for you. So okay.
Questions. Do you want to? Christine Tracy says, do you have a large social media presence? Do you spend a lot of time on social media platforms to build an audience? Is this necessary, in your opinion, to get a book contract? Well, I actually have a pretty broad social media presence. It's something that, because I've been writing a lot of different things, and I've been involved with the literary community for a long time. I know a lot of people, and I think that's helped. I don't think it, thank goodness for Ruth, I don't think it made a difference in trying to get a book contract.
I wanted to publish the book all along, so.
But sometimes you can publish the book and then you are expected to create a big media presence.
Well, absolutely, because publishers don't have money for that, so yes, I think it matters a lot.
And I do think it's for the big publishers particularly, they expect you to come with a pretty broad social media presence. And even I've heard stories like, they want you to have 50,000 followers on Twitter or whatever, which seems ridiculous, but there are some publishers that do require that.
Which is why I think you're always better off going to more specialized presses. Don, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think my presence is minimal. I mean, in Facebook and Instagram, and that's about it. And Instagram, I mostly publish pictures rather than advance the cause of my book, and I should do better. But I think that it's as Marcia says, it's important. I should do more of it.
Instagram counts.
We can all, yeah, Instagram does count, and we can all do, I mean, I think ultimately we can all do more. It's just how much are you willing to put time and effort
Time.
in? Yeah,
Yeah.
we're all writers. We want to be writing, right?
Yeah.
Don't necessarily want to be on social media, but it's
And for some of us that it's just very difficult to do that,
yeah, yeah.
be public at all. So yeah.
Let's see. Chris Chandler says, did you go through periods during your writing when you felt tired of yourself and your story? And how did you deal with that? Yes. Yes. A lot. There were so many times when I just wanted to throw it against the wall and never look at it again. And then inevitably I would circle back around to it. And again, into that kind of that cyclic having to go back and revisit it. So I don't know, Don, how did you feel about it?
Oh, many times I said, I can't do this. You know, not only is this a piece of crap, I can't even finish this piece of crap, you know. And I would sometimes go and tell them, look, this is crazy. It's crazy. Why am I doing this? It's nuts. You know, this is a crummy book. It's never going to be any good. And then I would go back to it, of course. But one of the things I would do would be, after I got done freaking out, I would go back and either start at the beginning or start at some of my favorite parts that were already written, as if I were catching a wave again, even though I'm not a surfer, but you know, that kind of thing. Say, okay, now wait a minute, now this part worked. Let me read this part. Let me speak a little bit of this out loud. Let me wave my hands around, and then maybe I'll see that I can ride that wave someplace else. And most of the time I was able to do that, yeah. But definitely anyway, that sometimes I said, this is it, man. It's all over. It's done. I'm so done with this book. But I did always come back, and that's the thing. You got to go back. You got to always go back.
You know, sometimes I think if you've been writing for a long time, that when you hear yourself say, this isn't any good, this is mediocre, like a little red light comes on and a little bell, like, okay, you know, that's the time you don't stop. That's okay. Whenever you think it's mediocre crap, that it shouldn't see the light of day. Okay, you know, I felt that before.
Well, sometimes it's good though to put it down and to go do something outside. That's my big thing. Like to get out and, you know, and just put it down, go outside, take a long walk, and, you know, for a couple of days, don't think about it, give it a rest, and then come back to it. So
Don's catwalk spoke to me actually, because so many wonderful things have happened while walking.
just walking in the woods or what, yeah.
Absolutely. And I have often done that too. I'll get up and go for a walk or do something like that. But also I would put it down for months at a time as well.
Yeah.
So there were periods where I just set it aside and let it go until I could bring up enough emotional gumption to go back at it.
Right. Yeah.
See, I didn't have that luxury. I would love to. I mean, I've had it in other projects, but you know, I decided to write this book in July, and it hit the streets in October. So when I decided to step away from it, it was like had to be measured in hours or maybe one day. And I would say, I can't step away from this for any length of time, because then I have absolutely no chance of success. And so
because his book and Becky Cooper's book both deal with Jayne's murder in extremely different ways, but he and Becky are friends and they wanted them to come out together. And so he was on a time frame because hers was set by her huge publisher. And so
we have another question from Golnaz. Do you have to aim specifically on some communities like Cops for Dawn or Harvard alumni? Or like,
is this marketing? Is that about marketing? Is that what you're asking?
Is that a question about marketing, Golnaz? Yes. Yeah, she says yes.
Dawn would not be marketing this book to cops.
well, although I have a very nice picture of Detective Sennett holding the book up in his hand, and he liked it.
Well, you should put that on Instagram, Don.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have thought a lot about one of the communities that I am very interested in becoming involved with and more deeply involved with, and that is the community of others who have struggled with complex trauma, and particularly complex childhood trauma. So one of the things I've connected with the Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Foundation, and I'm going to be getting involved with them in some ways, volunteering with them, and hoping to help others who have struggled with complex trauma. So in that way, yes, I think there are communities that we can reach out to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good idea if what you're writing is fits with a particular community. Definitely start thinking about that as you're thinking about marketing your book. So, yeah.
Any other questions? We're almost out of time.
Does anybody want to add anything, or?
Feel free to unmute yourself. Lisa, could you talk more about how you decided to write in second person? Was it a conscious choice or more intuitive?
Well, I had done it before and I liked it. But when I started this book, really I was sitting at my desk, okay, it's time to go. And I just typed, you look at the phone. Okay, I'm going to do second person then. And I had thought about it a little earlier, I guess, and said that I would try it. But so Lisa, I guess the answer is it was both. It felt right, but I also made a decision. Okay, I think I'm going to do it that way.
Gomez, she asked a question about what does it look like to write in second person. So Gomez, in that case, you're addressing the reader as you. And you use the second person you instead of I, or in third person, it would be the. So that's the difference.
Yeah, and it's easy one can get a little confused doing that, but you can usually catch it.
Well, it takes some skill to write in second person, especially through a long work like a book. It definitely requires some skill to pull that off, for sure. So,
well, any other questions or any other comments? It says, love all three of your books, Marcia, Dawn, and Jayne. Beautiful, thank you. Martha says, Marcia, thank you for the beauty and honesty and clarity of your memoir. It resonated so deeply for me as one who has a complicated relationship with my face. Gratitudes for your work. And Lisa says, Dawn, you used that second person point of view masterfully. So what a marvelous discussion, Mary Johnson says. Thank you. So thoughtful. So great to see everyone.
Thank you,
everyone. So, I want to thank Jayne Benjulian, author of 5 Sextillion Atoms, Marcia Meier, author of Face, a Memoir, and Dawn Mitchell, author of Shibai, Remembering Jane Britton's Murder, for being here today. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And remember that you can order these books at any bookstore, brick and mortar or online. And especially if you do go online, we recommend bookshop.org or indiebound.org because they both support independent booksellers. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ruth, for being such a wonderful moderator.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And also just to note though, all these books are available in ebook form, Kindle.